So this is the second video that I'm going to do on AS fiscal policy, looking at some slightly more advanced things, so going beyond the straightforward analysis of how it affects AD and looking at things in a little bit more detail. So to start off with, we're obviously going to be using the aggregate demand components here. As I mentioned in the previous one, the net exports is generally not affected by fiscal policy, or at least not as far as we're concerned in AS, so we can kind of ignore this this one. So when we think about the government involving itself in the economy in terms of fiscal policy, one of the key, or in fact some of the key kind of ones that it deals with are when the government itself spends money. Okay, so I just want to kind of have a look at what that actually means. So what we're talking about here is G and I. Remember that the government, when it spends money, can contribute to either G or I. It depends what it's spending the money on. If it spends it on what's called current expenditure, day-to-day expenditure, that counts as G. If they actually spend it on building stuff, then that's I. So if we think about it in terms of the healthcare or something like that, if the government decides to build a new hospital, that's I. They're creating capital, so they are investing. The salaries that they pay the doctors and nurses, the money that they spend on the drugs and so on, all of that is considered G. So G and I, it doesn't really matter for the analysis which one it is particularly, but you do need to be aware that that the government can contribute to both the G and I components of fiscal policy. Just whilst we're here, before we move on, I wanted to kind of have a little bit of a mention about C as well, because obviously the government indirectly can influence C through predominantly income taxes, but we will have a look at that a little bit later on and see how well that actually works. But for the moment, I want to move on and I want to consider how the government spending money in the economy generates something called the multiplier effect. So we know that the economy, in very simple terms, is made up of households and firms, and the households spend money in the firms. They spend money, let's kind of clarify this actually, so rather than kind of saying goods there, so we have money going that way, okay, from households to firms, okay, so let's kind of clarify that. So that's money for goods going that way. Okay, so money for the goods and services goes from households to firms, and then from firms back to households goes money for labour, okay, which we obviously call wages. Okay, so this is our basic circular flow. When we only have households and firms acting in the economy, there's this very simple flow. Now, as we also looked at last year, there are various external economic actors who can influence the circular flow, and obviously the one that that we are going to be thinking about here is the government. Okay, so we're going to be considering how the government, okay, can influence this circular flow. All right. Now, obviously, what happens is that the government can take money out of the circular flow in the form of taxation, okay, and it can also add money back in again in the form of investment, okay. So what we can think about is that the government can take money out of the circular flow, okay. So for instance, when the government charges the firms corporation tax, or when it claims the money from VAT and so on, then the government is acting as a withdrawal, okay, and is removing money from the circular flow in the form of tax. Okay, so obviously doing that reduces the amount of money which is in the circular flow. They also, though, as we've said, can put money back into the circular flow again as either G or I. Now, obviously, when the government decides to build a hospital or something like that, it doesn't build it itself. It's not actually the civil service that build it. The government will pay firms, building firms, to go and build it. Okay, so that's basically the government putting money back into the economy in the form of G and I. Now, when we think about the circular flow, okay, the important thing to remember is that we count AD each time the money is spent. Okay, so what this means is that actually when the government puts money into the economy, okay, so when the government adds money into the economy as G and I, okay, that money actually doesn't just stop with the firms, because obviously the firms will spend it on workers, okay, as wages, so it will end up in the households, okay, and the households will then spend it on goods from other firms. So if you think about it, obviously the government will pay the building firm, the building firm will pay its contractors, and the contractors may go and spend their money at Sainsbury's or something like that. It ends up back with the firm again, okay? Now, obviously some of it will be leaked out in the form of tax, okay, but then obviously the firms that have received that spending from the customers will then spend it again on more workers. So Sainsbury's or whatever will use the money to spend a little bit more, to employ more workers and so on. So more money goes to the households, and in turn more money then is available to go back to the firms. Again, more of the money is taken out in tax. Tax is also coming out from the households as well. It just makes the diagram quite complicated if you have it coming out everywhere. And then obviously some money remains and it goes round. Okay, that effect there that we're talking about is called the multiplier. Okay, and the important thing is it means that the increase in AD, okay, is greater than the increase in the injection which caused it. Okay, that's the important aspect of it. Okay, so thinking in diagram terms, up at the top right here, if we have aggregate supply like that, okay, the initial increase in G, okay, let's say, will increase AD to there, but then there will be a multiplier effect. Okay, so actually, okay, although the initial government expenditure increased output from Y to Y1, the fact that there's a multiplier means that actually overall our output rises to Y2 as a result of this expenditure. So in this slide we're just going to look at some of the things that will influence the outcome of fiscal policy. So we've said that that fiscal policy generally works by shifting the AD curve to the right, or at least that's what happens if we want to pursue expansionary fiscal policy. So what will the actual outcome depend on? Well, we know that the outcome will generally be higher price levels through demand pull inflation, lower unemployment and higher levels of real GDP. The higher level of real GDP means more economic activity, more people demanded for their labour, derived demand, and therefore unemployment goes down. So what does it depend on? Well, first and foremost, in terms of kind of the way you should think about evaluating this in an exam, okay, depends on the initial position of AD on AS, okay? And if we have a look at the diagram over here, you can see what I mean by that, all right? So if we look at two examples here, so I've tried to draw it as best I can on the screen here, with a similarly sized increase in aggregate demand. So AD to AD1 and AD3 to AD4. Now you can see AD to AD1, okay, we get a very small increase in the general price level, okay, but quite a large increase in real GDP. Okay, so when the AD curve is initially on the horizontal part of the AS curve, got lots of spare capacity in the economy, which means that we can get growth without the inflationary pressure. If, though, we consider this one over here, and again doing this as best I can without lines or anything on the screen to help me, okay, we get a much higher level of inflation. Okay, so we get P3 to P4 inflation over here, and only Y1 to Y2 of growth. Okay, so the payback that we get from fiscal policy depends very much on where the AD curve is to begin with. It also obviously depends on the magnitude of the change. So a big change in government fiscal policy will mean a bigger change in AD and therefore a bigger final outcome. And related to what we saw on the last slide, okay, it is influenced by the size of the multiplier. Okay, there's some disagreement about how big the multiplier is. In the AA2 videos, we will consider the fact that different forms of government expenditure have different multipliers, but at AS level, it's enough to say that it will depend on the multiplier. If the multiplier is small, then the change in AD will also be small. So those are three things that, that fiscal policy effectiveness will depend on. And the last thing then that I want to consider in terms of fiscal policy effects is the long-run effect on AS. Okay, now certain government projects like Crossrail, which you can see here. Okay, so this is the Crossrail tunnels being drilled. Okay, there is a strong argument that suggests that obviously in the short term these will, as we have already seen, increase aggregate demand. Okay, this is a massive investment. Okay, so the government is paying £32 billion to companies to actually build this. That 32 billion is investment, and as we've seen, that is already subject to the multiplier. So the argument is that that will have already boosted the GDP of the economy by more than that 32 billion. But you can also argue, because this is actually improving the efficiency of distribution of factors of production with the economy and the ease with which they can move around, that there is a second beneficial effect of this, and that is to actually increase long-run aggregate supply. Okay, so if we have our price level and real GDP, okay, what we've got then, if I start us with a Keynesian curve like that, okay, and our aggregate demand like that, okay, what we know is that this initial investment that we've already spoken about will lead to a fairly substantial increase in aggregate demand. Okay, and as we've equally also seen, okay, that generates an increase in inflation as well as this increase in output. So we do get increased employment, we do get increased real GDP, but it comes at the expense of an increase in the price level. But what we can also say with this is that actually, because this also has long-run improvements to aggregate supply by increasing the amount of capital, it will also increase long-run aggregate supply, which means that the overall effect will be that the increase in real GDP will be bigger than initially seen, and the increase in inflationary pressure will actually be smaller. So one of the really kind of advantageous things of effective and productive, that's the important thing, okay, in order for this to happen, the spending must be productive. Okay, if the government can generate productive spending, then actually they not only get this short-term increase in aggregate demand, we also get a long-run increase in aggregate supply. And that can make fiscal policy very powerful indeed. And that long-run effect is another thing that you should bear in mind when evaluating the effectiveness of fiscal policy.